All right, Skyler, how's it going, man? It's been a while since we've been able to catch up, and I know you've been staying very busy with the mentorship with Anas and Sean. So how's that been going for you, dude?
It's been good, man. We're on week 6 right now. We're kind of getting into sort of the weeks where we're wrapping it all together and talking about problem solving. Like we went over programming and technique and injury management and some of the other stuff, and we're kind of using this time to basically put it together and say, how do I problem solve for someone in front of me going through these issues? It's going well. Everyone's been pretty involved, and the calls have been great.
Nice, nice. Yeah, that's been it's something I'm excited to see kind of how it grows and progresses from here. Early on, I was hoping to be, a part of this first iteration, then realized
Yep.
that having a newborn at home it took precedent at the moment. So maybe in the future a little bit of collaboration there, which could be really really fun to get into. But
Yeah.
Skylar and I have been talking recently about some of like we're just kind of like the jaded old man in powerlifting, even though we're not that old. And so we're just like our frustrations with some of the modern powerlifting approaches to programming.
Mm.
And this is sort of building off of the last video that we recorded. Now it's been months ago. Because I mentioned a newborn. I know it was months ago because Gabby was very much so a newborn at that time.
Yep.
So it's been a while, but in that first video, we talked about an old article post I had made. It was about predictable programming approaches and ways to make training as predictable as possible, especially going into a competition. And the reason I bring up that article is because in that article, at one point, I kind of talked through like a theoretical progression across a macro cycle and how like one block would be really high rep hypertrophy focus. The next one would be moderate rep strength focus. And then you'd have like the power peaking focus afterwards. So very much so leaning into block periodization and phase potentiation, those two things being kind of like key tenets of programming at the time when I wrote that article.
Mm.
Modern powerlifting programming has certainly drifted away from that. And reason I bring that up is because I think what we're going to be ranting about essentially is how some of that stuff might still be of value
Mm.
within a block of training and bigger picture for powerlifting. So I know this stemmed mostly from us kind of joking back and forth about like the week 4 obsession that
Yep.
people have. And really, I mean, it's you could boil this down to even like the obsession over the primary day and how
Mm.
that kind of manifests in just a training week itself, let alone if you scale that out then to a mesocycle or even a macro cycle. Um, but and again, kind of referring back to what I was just saying with the block periodization, the old understanding of training where we had these distinct periods of hypertrophy training, strength, or hypertrophy focused training, strength focused training, then peaking was each one was like a necessary evil for the next thing. So like the only way to get stronger with a very limited reductionist view of training was to get bigger. And it was kind of this cycle that you would wash, rinse, and repeat over and over again across periods of training.
Mm.
Um, and with this weird obsession now with the week 4 and the intra mesocycle or intra block performance needing to show up on week 4, people kind of neglect that like this then that mentality of like I need to train really hard to set up really good training,
Yep.
and they're just focusing on the really big week 4, which is one of my biggest complaints with it is that people will sandbag entire blocks of training or a majority of that block of training in
Yep.
hopes that that week 4 shows up really really well, and then on a smaller scale within a week of training they'll start to sandbag secondary tertiary quaternary whatever modern term we want to apply to it. They'll
Yep.
start to sandbag those sessions and the accessories that are within them that ultimately are the thing that are driving their success and their progress long term.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I don't quite know where it stemmed from. You mentioned a misapplication of things, and I think one of the things that has kind of ended up biting powerlifters in the ass is the realization that hypertrophy occurs across many different rep schemes, and people realize, oh, I don't need to do high rep, therefore I can just do normal training, and I
Yep.
don't need to focus on volume and hypertrophy. And it's like, no, you still need those things. And I just think people have taken many different findings and kind of Frankensteined it together into this modern approach that is, again, very reductionist in nature and just focused on how can I get this really big top set once every month if
Right.
I'm lucky, and the stars just seem to align. So I don't know.
Yeah.
That's my somewhat clear rant about it.
Right. And like kind of building off of that, man, I made that post about like the golden microcycle. And I was saying how like we use it in our own training models, but I think that a very common problem that I'll see, I've done this myself, but I'll see it with lifters as well, is they get really wrapped up in like the current block that they're in. And when they're like deeming, oh, what works, what doesn't work, a common example that I gave was like, a lifter is pushing their training really hard, doing very stimulating, challenging training. They're making good progress. They hit a little bit of a fatigue wall, and then their performance starts to come down. And then they like strip their training stress back, and then they like basically, in a way, taper and peak and super compensate. And they think like, oh, dude, like I have to sandbag my secondaries and like save it for the week 4. And because of that misunderstanding, then they just kind of like flatline. And it's like,
Hmm.
I kind of like related almost to like how we taper for a meet. Like the way that we taper, we like can plan ahead, of course, but it's like it has to be very context dependent. Like if a lifter is really, really, really fatigued, you're probably gonna have to shy away from like the train into the meet style because that's not gonna pull fatigue back enough. Or the opposite, if a lifter is just not fatigued at all, you don't cut their volume in half and strip everything away. It's very, context dependent. And I think what I was getting at before was that it's almost this kind of misunderstanding of fitness versus performance, where when we are looking at like the fitness fatigue model, for example, it's almost like performance and fatigue have like this in just purely on paper, like a inverse relationship. When fatigue is really high, performance starts to drop. But you can have fatigue be really high and like you got fitness cooking under the hood. And then when you pull it back, you reveal your true fitness. And people will basically, in that example, fatigue is high, masking their fitness. They strip it back and they reveal their fitness, and they think that that's what builds their strength, but that's just kind of what shows it. If that kind of makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
No, it makes perfect sense. Yeah, like I said, it's this understanding that good long and I keep saying long term training is reliant on the hard work that often dampens performance. And so
Mm-hmm.
seemingly, if you don't have like reasonable metrics or markers of progress, you might think you're actually progressing at times. You know, if you're
Mm-hmm.
so fatigued that performance comes down so much for that one top set that you've put on this pedestal, then you might think, oh my God, everything's wrong. I need to reshape the microcycle. I need to
Yeah.
pace my block differently, which is everybody's obsession now too.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of just accepting that I need to keep training hard. And by training hard, you might still, again, accumulate fatigue, have performance come down, but eventually that is an adaptable quality too. And
Mm-hmm.
performance will start to catch up, and even if your performance is down 10 to 20% because your fatigue is so high, your fitness is climbing so much over time. And
Mm-hmm.
so you'll start to see your performance start to scale up too. And then if you do taper or have this really good approach to a peaking block, then that's when you actualize all that development that you've had and you have that super compensation occur. You hit the platform, you hit these massive PRs.
Yeah.
um, so yeah, it's strange, and it's especially frustrating to see that obsession for athletes who are in that beginner to intermediate stage of training, where
Yeah.
like they are, again, not to lean on the phase periodization or potentiation thing too much, but they are in that phase of training, like zoom way out, 20-year powerlifting career, zoom all the way out. They are in that phase of training where they need to emphasize all of that really hard, grueling work tenfold. They don't need to worry about their performance. Go hit the platform a couple times a year, whatever. But you need to be focused on getting bigger and stronger.
Yeah.
And if that masks your performance, it doesn't matter because you're not very good at powerlifting yet. Like that is just I mean, that is just, I mean, that's a shitty way to put it. You have not reached your genetic potential. That's the more eloquent way to phrase that.
Same,
I'm
bro.
talking like I'm a big dog. I never qualified for nationals, so I can't talk shit. But
Yeah. Right.
point being, if you are an undersized, not strong powerlifter and you're worried about your week 4 and your primary day too much,
Mm-hmm.
you are barking up the wrong tree entirely.
Mm-hmm.
If you are like the upper echelon, most elite powerlifter in the world, and you're worried about micromanaging those sort of details, I think that's actually justifiable.
Mm-hmm.
Because you have fleshed out so many details and gotten things really refined and done all of that necessary legwork in advance, to make it understandable that you would be worried about such a subtle detail.
Hmm.
Um, but God, it's always the people who are, or it's not always, it's often the people who are so early in their development who
Yep.
are worried about these details. And I'm like, please just put your head down and train hard. It
Yeah.
doesn't even need to be smart training. Just train hard. And this is where the old head mentality comes out of training, I guess. But
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, then we have the opposite where we have our lifters like RP 10ing everything and we're like, whoa, slow down, you know? So, of course, obviously, like
Right.
context dependent, but I think that, you know, a big piece of it is like just like, I mean, kind of talking about the fitness fatigue model idea. I think it's just like a big misunderstanding of fatigue where we think that our only goal is to keep fatigue low, but our goal is not necessarily to drive fatigue up as high as possible. Our goal is we got to train hard enough to actually get bigger and stronger. And if you're doing that, fatigue is going to kind of come along for the ride. Intelligent programming, recovering well, like that keeps it generally at bay. But kind of like piggybacking off of what you said, I think this is a big part of like my fascination lately with work capacity as a trainable quality
Mm.
because oftentimes lifters will get really wrapped up on like those small ebbs and flows and performance because of fatigue coming in. But it really depends on like what the marker of progression is that you're even tracking in your training. Like if you only look at your top sets as a dictation of where things are going, typically we'll look at like E1RMs tracked across a block
Mhm.
on an indicator set, single, double, triple. And if the goal really isn't peak performance and maybe it's on, driving muscle size or bringing up my baseline loads, work capacity improvements, that might not be the thing I want to look at. I might want to check it and make sure it's not absolutely getting obliterated, right? But those goals are going to coincide with higher amounts of fatigue that long term are going to bring my strength up. But in the short term, I'm going to see a little bit of a dip. And the issue is that I think a lot of coaches, maybe not on purpose by any means, but just on accident, they will really hold on to that like week 4 or that sparing of the E1RM to the point that like you'll see like a week 3 dip and they're like, oh, we got to taper and strip the secondaries down and oh, we got to maximally recover. And then they come through on the week 4 and it's this mentality shift that probably needs to happen to just get people used to caring a little bit less about those ebbs and flows and just finding ways to train hard and knowing when that is applicable, down the line. Like if you're peaking for a meet and your top sets are tanking, dude, we gotta figure that out and find a more predictable training model, of course. But there's got to be a larger percentage of your training used for building rather than
Mhm.
just trying to peak and express all the time.
Yeah, I like that example of the like the theoretical week 3 dip going into the week 4. And to be clear, this same principle applies. I don't care if you're a coach who is married to a 4-week block, a 5-week block, whatever it may be. If you're obsessed with just how that block has ended, and not the progress that's happened along the way, that's what we're speaking to here.
Yeah.
So I like that example though. So the week 3 dip, say things are coming down, and it just seems like performance on those top sets, which we do use as a marker of progress, it's not going the way that we expected going into that final push of the block. What I've done, and I'm curious if you have any examples too, is I just view it as an opportunity to do something else with training. So maybe we're using those top sets as a marker of progress, and it goes well for a few weeks. We hit that week 3, doesn't go well. But I see an opportunity now, just based on what I know from the athlete's training history, to go for maybe an all time volume PR for that week 4 session that they have for that particular day.
Mm-hmm.
What I'll look to do then is I might just remove the top set entirely. And then we go to straight sets, for example. And let's say we were doing, I don't know, a top single followed by 3 sets of 6. So we're doing 19 total reps on that day when we would have the top set plus back downs. A simple change to going to like 4 sets of 5. So now you're adding one additional working rep, and maybe by reducing the number of reps per set compared to the 3x6, you're not doing the 4x5, you might actually be able to handle more weight, and therefore they are going to hit a higher volume marker within that session.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to use that as an opportunity to still create a win for the athlete. They're still feeling like they're progressing and doing something meaningful, which athletes, which I'll touch on this in a minute, really benefit from that. But also from a physiological standpoint, it's good to be able to hit those volume markers because that's maybe a sign of increased work capacity. It's also maybe a sign of just, increased strength and recoverability if they're able to do that and then hit their subsequent training sessions without issues. So it's still a marker of really good progress. It's just not the thing that they were used to with the previous training they had. So that's one example. I'm not quick to taper stuff like to try to set up that week 4
Mm,
unless it's coinciding with a mock meet or an actual competition. Obviously that would be more of a an emergency sort of situation where you're like, we got to
right.
get this thing sorted out. But the volume focus is a big one. I don't know if you have any other examples that you can think of off the cuff.
Not really. I mean, that's like the perfect way to go about it, in my opinion. It's kind of like the peak end rule theory kind of layered into
Yep.
programming strategies. I think one thing that I've done, this isn't really like tying into like necessarily the end of the block, but just like as a general strategy, I try to tell my lifters that you want to not really too heavily assign the labels of like primary, secondary, tertiary, because it's important for us as coaches to know that, but as the lifter, all too often we'll see a lifter think primary is the most important, secondary, tertiary, and then they kind of treat those sessions with that intent. And like
Hmm.
you'll see a lifter like they bench, I don't know, like let's just say they bench like 315 and their
Hmm.
secondary they have like a 2 count single and they're doing like 225 and it's like, bro, what are we doing? We got to get that up a little bit higher, man. Like you almost have to. It's kind of like meathead mentality, and this segues into our like old head rant here. But it's like if you want to bench or squat or deadlift a certain weight, you almost have to like you have to make sure that the loads you're using actually reflect that, right?
Right.
Like why are your fives sub 70%? And like why are you benching or dumbbell benching the 50s, bro? Like we got to be dumbbell
Yeah.
benching the 100s, and we got to be like doing a 3x5 with 80+%. Like you don't have to force it, of course, but like I think that's where a big mentality shift probably needs to happen for a lot of athletes for the better. Like you shouldn't really be thinking too much most of the time about how do I pace my week 4 the right way. It's like how do I get my secondaries and my baseline strength and like everything that supports my primary day to come up, because if you're trying to peak all the time and there's no platform to stand on, that's when everything feels like, for lack of a better word, feels like complete shit, right?
Yeah.
Like you feel weak when you don't train hard enough. You feel really not great when you have no muscle on your frame. When you are able to get those improved though, that's when you start feeling really, really strong. And there will be times where it's like, you want to strip some stuff back and peak and see what's cooking, but like you got to actually cook something before you pull it out of the oven. That's a good
Right.
example to give. You know what I mean?
Right. Right. Yeah. And I even remember there were so many times when I was training more diligently, and I hardly train at all. So literally any other time when I was training is probably a
The
better
once a
example than
month
now. But
protocol.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But I remember when I was near my best total, which would have been right around 700 kilos. Um, there were times that I definitely screwed up a block, and I was like, I pushed that weight. There were times I pushed RDLs too hard, and it would screw up my next squat day or my next deadlift that I had. And they were just there as a supplementary accessory movement. But I love training hard, and I you could never knock me for not trying, or you cannot knock me for my effort, I should say, with training. And at times that did mean the primary day, which we didn't even call it that when I was doing this, it suffered and I didn't perform well. And I was still better for it because then the next block, when I managed that one detail a little bit better, I was benefiting from the really hard training I had done the previous block. And I think that's a really, really important point too of like, it's okay if it screws up that one block of training. You're probably going to benefit from it within reason.
Mm-hmm.
The next go around and the next primary day or secondary day or whatever we want to call it. But I do like that mentality too of like, if you want to squat the certain amount of weight, you have to earn it. It's not just going to be delivered to you on a silver platter. It reminds me sort of, and it's half cringy, but also very applicable, I think. When I first started powerlifting coaching, I was working with somebody, and the like first iteration of systematic strength t-shirts we got said "act like it" on the back, and
Yeah.
that was his mantra for himself. He was like, I have all these goals and I need to act like it. and in his training. I was like, I like that. You know, like I'm not a big mantra guy, but like I do agree. You know, if you want to hit these total goals, do what you need to do to actually make it happen. You have to act like you want to do that. So, and eventually, like you said, like all of this is a trainable quality too. Like your work capacity, your recoverability, um, everything benefits from just training really, really hard. So in
Mm-hmm.
the short term, might take a little bit of a hit, um, but in the long term, you're probably going to actually improve because you decided to push training a bit harder. And it's so important to remember too. This is all like context driven, and it's also under the guise of like this is all within reason. Like I'm not saying go RP 10, be irresponsible. Like we're still trying to live in sort of that low to moderate RPE range for a majority of our training
Yeah.
probably. But like to tell yourself, oh, this set that was actually like an RPE 5 was an RPE 7 because I just don't want to train harder. That's where you're doing yourself a disservice as an
Yeah.
athlete. So you mentioned the peak end rule, and that is exactly what I was going to segue into when I mentioned the sort of that idea of like creating wins for athletes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is where I can give a little bit of credit to the modern obsession with the 4 week block or whatever it may be. And by that I mean, so before I move any further forward, I guess the peak end rule, it's the psychological phenomenon. It's pretty much saying that an individual is going to base the totality of their experience off of the peak and the end of the experience itself. So, to give a more clear example, if you watch a movie, you're going to review that movie largely based on the peak, like the climax crescendo of that movie, and then how the movie ended. You're not going to base it off of the 15-minute in random cutscene that didn't really play into the movie too much. So, in a powerlifting context, it is important for us to consider that psychological phenomenon or bias that we have,
Mm-hmm.
um, and find a way to create a really notable high point for the athlete within that phase of training or that block of training and towards the end of the training. Because if you can get those two things to coincide pretty close together, it does sort of amplify the effect of the peak end rule. So it's very, very important. That is where the 4 week block structure, I would argue, does have a little bit of value for powerlifters. You know, ultimately, we can't ask powerlifters to just train mindlessly and to just continue training without any sort of block structure. So I do find myself, even as a critic of the modern powerlifting approach, I find myself gravitating towards a 4 to 5 week block length, just naturally kind of gravitate towards that because it creates structure for the athlete. And it from my experience, just keeps them a little bit more engaged with their training. Do you find yourself sort of doing the same thing?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's best from like a planning perspective as well. Like if we have a meet on the horizon, I want to make sure that I'm generally lining things up, or like if we have weeks left over, I'll know like okay, maybe we have time to stretch this block out, or if we need a deload or a pivot week, I'm going to insert it around this time. But I generally do it from that perspective. But I find myself kind of like building off of the peak end rule theory idea. Aside from like teaching athletes to, I mean, for again, lack of a better term, give less of a shit about fatigue coming in and impacting their end of blocks when they're in an off season training period, is I'll use static RP a lot more, or at least like smaller jumps on like a primary session. Like I think a big reason why people weight the week 4, week 5 thing so heavy is because we program in a way for them to care that much. Where like when your week 1 is like 50 keys below your week 4, it's like, oh yeah, week 1 is literally pointless and has no value for me. And then when you're taking this monumental jump, whether it's helpful or not is not really the case, but more so just speaking purely from a mentality standpoint, that lifter is going to put so much of a mental emphasis on that day going well, to the detriment of one, the productivity of the rest of the blocks probably going to be in the gutter because they're like, oh, just save it for the week 4. Going to keep these
Right.
accessories light. I'm going to taper the secondary, intro week and deload. It's like, bro, you're just deloading for like 7 weeks and then you try to max out. No wonder you feel weak, right?
Right.
But then when it goes inevitably poorly, right? Like this is where we see these athletes like totally crash out and check out of their training, and then it feeds the cycle of like, oh, my week 4 went bad, training's bad, they care less, training goes even worse,
Hmm.
week 4 is even worse. powerlifting's not for me. And I'm rambling at this point, but like just personally, the worst training periods I've ever gone through was when I was really, really worried about fatigue and like trying to pace everything
Mhm.
the exact right way, worrying too much about, oh, should I do this load or that, And the best training I've ever done, bar none, was when I stopped caring about that at all. And I know, like, of course, context, like, yes, we need to manage fatigue and not overshoot all the time. There's a plan in place, but like the best training I've ever had was when accessories were treated like main lifts and secondaries were not treated as secondaries. They were treated as this is a lift. I need to get better. I got to get my 2 count single up. I got to get my fives up. I got to get this 4x6 up. And when that started happening and I stopped caring so much about like the end of block experience and just took it for what it was and brought it to the gym no matter what, there were ups and downs, of course, and nonlinear progression. But then 3 months down the line, which is a better time frame to track when these things should be peaking, that was when it's like 15-pound PR, 20-pound PR, 50-pound PR randomly, right? When
Mhm.
we're trying to like overly manage things, we just get wrapped up in the details that your coach should be doing, and we just kind of forget to train hard.
Yeah, 100%. I think I like that point too of your best training without a doubt was when you were pushing everything
Yeah.
with the idea of this is equally important to the top single or the top set that I have on this comp specific movement. And it reminded me my best training I ever had when I was hitting that decent total was when I was in a 10 by 10 woodshed, sweating my ass off or freezing my ass off and giving a lot of shit about high bar pause sets of five.
Yeah.
And I was like, I am going to break my back under this bar because I want to get 10 more pounds on last week. It genuinely was just this mentality of like, I will do whatever it takes to get my lifts stronger. And
Mhm.
I understood at the time that every single lift I was doing was as meaningful as the next one for making that actually happen. So,
Mhm.
again, big time ups and downs. There were times where I would deal with back or shoulder pain and I would have to scale back like crazy. But that was done more so for my own well-being and less so because I was worried that fatigue was presenting a certain way. It's because it hurt.
Yeah.
And so again, that's an
I'm gonna
extreme
have to
example.
snap my shit
Maybe
up,
don't take it
bro.
to that point. Yeah.
Yeah,
um,
exactly.
but yeah, it leads to really productive training. And like you said, you have to zoom out and think long term. What does the trend line look like? Are we improving relative to like body weight? If you're moving up a weight class, is the dot score improving or whatever metric you choose to look at? Zoom out a bit and start thinking bigger picture because we're really looking at performance improving from one meet to the next if you are competing regularly, or if you're just doing this recreationally. Zoom out and look at a full year of training. Are your
Yep.
lifts better now than they were a year ago? Because that's where you're, especially after the first few years, that's kind of the time frame for like substantial increases in your total. Unless you were just genetically gifted and you've sort of won the genetic lottery in that sense, you might see more substantial jumps later into your career. But for most people, it's going to take a while for these sort of improvements to really be shown on paper. Again, kind of showing that there's probably value to what is now considered an outdated approach to training, which looks a lot like block periodization or phase potentiation. And it doesn't mean that it has to be that sort of approach has to feature like these really, really big swings in number of reps being performed because we do understand that hypertrophy and strength can be trained at varying intensities with different number of reps, but it does mean that you can't always overemphasize the comp specific stuff. At times it is important to understand that performance doesn't matter that much. This is a time for me to put my head down and get to work. I think that's kind of my summary of sorts for everything that we've talked about. I'm
Mhm.
trying to think if there's anything else that I'm just jaded about that I want to mention, but that pretty much covers it, I think.
Powerlifting as a whole, basically.
Yeah, why don't we throw the bar over our heads? Weightlifting's way cooler looking.
Exactly. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
I know, dude. I'm
Oh,
gonna. My week 4 went bad, so I'm gonna pick up bodybuilding, aka
yeah.
recreational, getting a sick bicep pump once a month.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Yeah. I'm gonna get into power building, and then it just is what powerlifting training should look like in the off season.
Oh my god, it's
Power
like
building is literally what a volume phase used to be in powerlifting. Like that's
it.
all it is.
Well, this segues back to me complaining about made up terms, dude. Like, we're just like making shit up along the way. And I think it's good and bad in some ways, but oh my gosh. I'd like, on that similar note, maybe to close things out, it's like, I think we see a lot of people like ditch powerlifting for BJJ or quote unquote
Mhm.
bodybuilding because of these significant mental attachments to like, a very small percentage of your actual training, right? Like if you think about not even just like your week 4 top set, because that's a crazy small percentage, but like if you think about just your primary top set, like that is such a
Mhm.
small percentage of your total training, unless you're doing absolutely zero volume, which I mean, that's another problem in and of itself. But regardless,
Right.
like it's such a small percentage of your training that if you put such a large mental weight on it, it's not a question as to why lifters will have one block go wrong and they're already going to sign up to their local BJJ dojo, or like, yo, how do I like upgrade to the bodybuilding package or something? Like, you have
Right.
to, in tandem with understanding, like, hey, I have to push myself harder in the gym to make better progress. You have to kind of shift your focus and mentality away from that, like, I need to keep peak performance at its peak year round, to
Mhm.
I got to get stronger right now so that my peak performance can actually go up long term. It's like the ceiling floor analogy thing with the rope.
Yep.
Like your floor is down here and you're
Mhm.
trying to always get your ceiling up. Like I think in on paper your ceiling stays the same, but it honestly, I don't know if you've experienced this with lifters, but like in my opinion and my own personal experience with myself and lifters, it actually starts to go down because
Yeah.
we're biological organisms. We adapt to the stimulus we put on ourselves, or in this case, lack thereof. Like if you are peaking all the time and you are taking huge, ginormous jumps every week, your secondaries are like a complete joke, and your accessories are phoned in. Like I think it would make sense that your actual strength doesn't just stay the same; actually gets worse because you're not
Oh,
doing
yeah.
enough to maintain your fitness. You know what I mean?
100%. Yeah, it's all of the physiological things underpinning that ceiling, meaning your peak
Mm-hmm.
performance, they're dropping
Yep.
because you have shifted the emphasis away from them so much. Yeah, I see it. I mean, it happens all the time. And it's kind of frustrating because like I think it happens to people also when they get to a high level at times. Um, Again, this is a huge tangent. I don't want to make this too long, but there's a perspective of training long term, and I think I've written about this a little bit. It's I first read about it with the Thoughtful Pursuit of Strength, which is like the first powerlifting text I ever read. It's this view of training long term that it looks like a pyramid. So like the
Yep.
early stages, you're building the foundation, and then you're building upon that and upon that and upon that. You get to the highest level, you're at the peak of that pyramid, and that sort of pyramid exists for every single person. That's whatever your genetic potential is. But you still have to do that foundational work regardless of if you are the layperson doing a local meet or if you're Austin Perkins. It doesn't matter who you are, you have to follow that same process. A different perspective of long-term training, or before I even move on to that, the idea is at the peak of that pyramid, you only need to do sport specific stuff. You only need to do really, really specific work to your competition lifts. I think for the most part that view of long term training across a career holds up pretty well. There's another view of it, which I think I heard on it was either a barbell medicine podcast or reactive training systems, or maybe they collabed on it. But they talked about long term training perspective as being more of like an hourglass turned on its side,
Mm-hmm.
where you have this big degree, a lot of variety early in a career, and then it sort of bottlenecks when you get really advanced. But then once you get to a certain point, it kind of rebroadens and gets to a point where you need to start doing some of that foundational work once again. And I think it probably ties into the floor to ceiling analogy where you've done all this legwork, you've gotten yourself to a really good point, but then to continue stressing your system so that it actually adapts as we do as biological organisms, you have to do some of that foundational work again. You have to make sure that muscle mass is maintained or even improved because you've probably maximized your muscle's ability to create force or produce force, I should say, and like the neurological component of strength expression too. So that
Mm-hmm.
foundational work then becomes that much more meaningful again. So I do think that sort of like cat and mouse game of floor and ceiling occurs across a career. And yeah, so the novice to intermediate lifter definitely experiences that if they shift their focus away. But I think even the most advanced elite lifters in the world probably should pay some attention to that too, to keep their themselves either, like, worst case at that really high level, and best case to continue to improve,
Mhm.
to get their numbers up even once they've hit, these world record totals or whatever they may be hitting.
Mhm.
um, so yeah, I think there was one other point I had, but again, I don't want to make this too long. that
We've
might
been
that
rambling,
might
I
be enough of
know.
a tangent.
Yeah. But
um,
I mean, kind
Go
of
ahead, go ahead.
just quickly building off of that, it's like a bottleneck that you currently have may not have been a bottleneck before, right? Like it's kind of like, I mean, with the floor ceiling analogy, I think the best part of that whole analogy, I mean, maybe not the best part, but that just it really ties the whole thing together, is that you might hear someone say, oh, like, your floor has to come up for your ceiling to go up. um, there are plenty of lifters that have terrible technique and no muscle and bad work capacities, and they make progress. And it's
Yep.
because the slack isn't taken out of the rope. Eventually, long term, you get to a point where it's like, damn, I can't keep progressing with this absolutely terrible technique. This is now my new bottleneck. So it's like,
Right.
when you're going from that, beginner to novice to intermediate, like, there are things that are not necessarily limitations yet that may rear their head down the line. And that's where there's that case that, like, man, I gotta, like, find ways to do more of XYZ. Like, my work capacity was here. And if I want to get here, it's got to get bigger. Or if I want to, you know, go from this total to this total, I can't be, this amount of muscle mass. I got to get bigger as well. So it's like kind of just, reaffirming that idea that, like, what is currently working may not work forever. And I think that's maybe honestly the current obsession with programming too, which could be a whole nother video about
Yeah.
doing what works. When does that eventually stop? And why does it stop? I think it's because of this. Like, you eventually develop new limitations and bottlenecks that act as a constraint to the whole system. And what used to work may not work, a
Right.
year and a half down the line. And that's where all this kind of comes from.
Yeah, and I just remembered the last thing I wanted to comment on. So I split my time between being a powerlifting coach and a strength and conditioning coach. And with the powerlifting coaching, it's the programming's a lot more monotonous across the year. Like, you don't have these really big swings in what training looks like. Generally, people will send me an intake form. They say they can train 5 days a week. That's going to stay that way. And the only time they're not going to train 5 days a week is probably meet week or the week after a competition, unless they're taking a vacation or something. Otherwise, we're just training 5 days a week. We're trying to improve and get these physical qualities up. But, like, you're not doing anything too different. Even with my appreciation of some of the what's considered outdated programming approaches, I'm not going to change things but so much, because I
Yeah.
still want training to be productive and engaging. Um, the team sports strength and conditioning that I do is the exact opposite. Early off season with the team, I might get them 5 days a week. And the reason I bring that up, or I should say, 5 days a week, early off season, 1 to 2 days a week end season. So that you have these really big swings. The reason I bring that up is because in the early off season, if I'm working with a soccer team, I do not care if they are terrible at that sport during that phase of the year. In fact, I hope that they feel terrible playing their sport, because that means that I'm probably pushing their training hard enough to make their sport suffer.
Yeah.
And so it's very normal and widely accepted in this field with strength and conditioning that you have to do these things to then see a marginal improvement when they're doing their sport specific task 9 months down the line. And so it's always this perspective of being very zoomed out, this appreciation for more of a phase potentiation sort of approach, and an understanding that at times the sport is going to suffer. In powerlifting, it's not nearly as accepted. Lifters don't want to see their pride and joy lift take a hit. They want to
Yeah.
continue improving, and they need to see something measurable that will show them, okay, we're heading in the right direction. So the way to balance that is, yes, use your top sets, do whatever you want to do. Sure, don't overemphasize them. That is of the utmost importance. But also during those off-season periods of training, find other things to focus on. Josh Hall is one of my favorite lifters I've ever worked with, because he's so engaged in training. That dude celebrates a belt squat PR as much as he does a competition PR. I swear to you. Like
Yeah.
he is super, super engaged. He's also like the most excited lifter ever. He's great to work with. Love working with that dude. You've handled him at meets too, so you know what I'm talking about. The
Oh
energy
yeah.
he has. But yeah, he genuinely will celebrate that as much as he does an American record deadlift.
Hmm.
And I think that sort of quality and that unwavering commitment to just improving in all facets of training will push him to much greater heights than if he were super, super focused on, the week four showing up perfectly. So that's just to use a little bit of anecdote there, kind of combining the powerlifting experience that I have with athletes versus the team sport and just showing you some different angles and why we might be missing the mark a little bit with how we go about things as modern powerlifting coaches at times.
Yeah.
Um, that was the last tangent. The monster brought that one out for me. I needed all 140 milligrams of caffeine to remember that one.
Yeah.
But is there anything else you wanted to add? I think I've let it all out.
I mean, we got more, but we can probably do another call because
We'll do.
this is such a dense topic, and I knew it was going to be a good one. That's why I picked
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. No, it's a go. We'll definitely do a follow up.
Yeah.
I will tell y'all, Skylar and I both have the same camera. We are not using either of them.
Nope.
I have it. I have it right here, and I completely
I,
forgot the cord for mine. Skylar said his was dead, and I don't have a microphone set up either. So if the camera quality is not holding up well for this, thank you for bearing with us. I'll
yeah.
probably try to get this uploaded to Spotify as well, sort of as a podcast, so you don't even have to worry about the camera quality if you're listening on that platform, which might be doing all a favor. But
Yeah.
thanks for tuning in, guys. We'll be checking in again. We want to do these a little bit more regularly, and we'll be in touch soon.